Hello again. As one of my favourite YouTubers, History Debunked, starts his videos. Check him out. Have you noticed the letters of my Hegel hat have fallen off? Cheap rubbish I bought off eBay. I hope it isn't an omen. A bad omen. Anyway, I'm wearing my James Joyce t-shirt because I'm doing research at the moment, a PhD, in giving a Hegelian reading of James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake. But I'm also on the side, trying to get other stuff published, articles and things. And one writer I'm very intrigued by is Brian Aldiss, who is, I suppose you could say, a hidden gem of English literature, because I find very little critical writing on his work. So I'm doing it myself, really. But I suppose the fact that there is so little of it has an advantage in that, well, I'm starting afresh, really. But without being too swayed by much of what I've read, because I haven't really read very much. I mean, there is some, but very little critical writing on his work. So I've writing some articles giving a Hegelian perspective. I'm starting off with the Millennia stories of his, because I find I could bring in Hegel's philosophy of history into a interpretation of what's actually going on in these stories. But first, we'll have to dive into what Hegel's philosophy of history is all about, as briefly as possible. So, the German words for history, there's two of them. History, from historia, the Greek. Inquiry, knowledge, science, a written account of inquiries, narrative, history of events, from historien, which is Greek. To inquire, explore. History, German, this found its way into the German language by way of Latin in the 13th century. From the 18th century, the use and development of the word was subdued, or perhaps I should say taken over more, by Geschichte, albeit the adjective historisch and the noun historica, historian, still thrived. The original sense of history approaches that of Erfahrung, experience. And Hegel is inclined to employ it for empiricism, as opposed to particularly historical experience and events. Hegel discourses disparagingly, in fact, upon historismus, as it is found in theology, meaning historical erudition concerning religious opinions and institutions, to the neglect of conceptual inquiry into religious truths. Geschichte, story, affair, business, history, a native German word deriving from geschehen, to be done, happen, occur, hence originally an event or a sequence of events. However, from the 15th century, it was associated with history and employed for a narrative or report. With the development of historical research and awareness in the 18th century, it acquired the meaning history as the systematic investigation of past events. It has this meaning in particular in theologian and philosopher Johann Gottfried von Herder, who we will come to again shortly. Geschichte is Hegel's usual word for history, a use of the word influenced by its relatedness with Geschick, skill, and Schicksal, fate or destiny, and its likeness to Schicht, stratum or layer. History therefore has two senses, the sequence of historical events and an account or study of such events. Philosophy of history therefore has two corresponding senses, philosophical reflection upon the course of historical events, philosophical reflection upon the nature and methods of accounts of historical events. Prior to Hegel, philosophy of history was of the first kind rather than of the second. Jan-Pista Vico, who I've become very acquainted with because, of course, with my reading of Finnegan's Wake, was the founder of the philosophy of history. In his Principles of a New Science of the Common Nature of Peoples of 1725, he contended that all peoples pass through a divine, a heroic, and a human stage, progressively developing from sensory thought to abstract thought, from the heroic ethic to morality, from privilege to equality of rights. Hegel never mentions Vico, although his presence is actually felt throughout James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake of 1939. He is there with reference to his cyclical view of history at the very beginning. River run past even Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay, brings us by a commodious vicus of recirculation back to House Castle and environs. A quote from Vico here. The history of human ideas is strictly confirmed by the history of philosophy itself. For the first kind of crude philosophy used by men was autopsia, or the evidence of the senses. It was later made use of by Epicurus, for he, as a philosopher of the senses, was satisfied with the mere exhibition of things to the evidence of the senses, and the senses of the first poetic nations were extremely lively, as we have seen in our account of the origins of poetry. And then came Aesop, of fables fame, or the moral philosophers, whom we would call a vulgar. As we have noted above, well, I was taken. I recommend reading the book anyway, because it is very readable. Aesop preceded the 7 sages of Greece. Aesop taught by example, and since he lived in what was still the poetic age, he took his examples from fictitious similitudes. The good Menenius Agrippa used one such to reduce the rebellious Roman plebs to obedience. An example of this sort, or better still, a true one, is even now more persuasive to the ignorant crowd than the most impeccable reasoning from maxims. After Aesop came Socrates, who introduced dialectic, employing induction of several certain things related to the doubtful thing in question. Voltaire coined the expression philosophie de l'histoire and described history in an essay on universal history, the manners and spirits of nations, from the reign of Charlemagne to the age of Louis XIV of 1756, as humankind's struggle for culture and progress. Of course, they usually talk about man, but I'm being inclusive here, very progressive. It's all history's men and women, isn't it? Here I am taking rather a general survey of the fate of mankind than of the revolutions of thrones. History should pay more attention than it does to the human race. Here it is that each writer ought to say homo sum. But instead of that, most historians have employed their pens in these descriptions of battles. Herder, who we met earlier, in Ideas on the Philosophy of the History of Mankind of 1791, saw human history as a development towards humanity. It is a continuation of the development of nature, and proceeds in accordance with the same laws, the order and lawfulness of the world, express the power and reason of God. So this is Herder. Our earth is a star among stars. If our philosophy of the history of man would in any measure deserve that name, it must begin from heaven. For as our place of abode, the earth, is of itself nothing, but derives its figure and constitution, its faculty of forming organized beings, and preserving them when formed, from those heavenly powers that pervade the whole universe, we must first consider it not simply by itself, but as a member of that system of worlds in which it is placed. It is bound by eternal invisible bonds to its centre, the sun, from which it derives light, heat, life, and vigour. Without this sun we can no more conceive our planetary system than a circle without a centre. With it, that beneficial power of attraction with which the eternal being has endued it and all matter, we perceive the planets formed in its domain according to simple, beautiful, and masterly laws, jocundly and incessantly revolving on their axes, and round one common centre, in spaces proportionate to their magnitudes and densities. Nay, by the same laws, round some of them moons are formed to revolve. Nothing so much exalts the mind as this contemplation of the grand structure of the universe, and never perhaps did human thought attempt so bold a flight, and in part with success, as when in Copernicus, Kepler, Newton, Huygens, and Kant it conceived and confirmed the simple, eternal, and perfect laws of the formation and motion of the planets. Immanuel Kant penned 2 reviews of Herder's ideas, Kant who Herder actually referred to there, and several essays on history, in particular Ideas for a Universal History with a Cosmopolitan Intent of 1784. Kant argued that despite free will, human actions are determined by universal laws, and at least to a great degree may manifest to a historian a regular pattern. The goal of history is a perfectly just and rational state that will secure the freedom necessary for the full development of human capacities and remain in perpetual peace with other similarly organized states. History was frequently viewed by, for instance, Gotthold Ephraim Lessing and Johann Gottlieb Fichte as the realization of divine providence, of God's plan for the education of the human race that will ultimately result in its perfection. So, a quote from Kant here. Whatever conception of the freedom of the will one may form in terms of metaphysics, the will's manifestation in the world of phenomena, that is, human actions, are determined in accordance with natural laws, as is every other natural event. History is concerned with giving an account of these phenomena, no matter how deeply concealed their causes may be, and it allows us to hope that, if it examines the free exercise of the human will on a large scale, it will be able to discover regular progression among freely willed actions. In the same way, we may hope that what strikes us in the actions of individuals as confused and fortuitous may be recognized in the history of the entire species as a steadily advancing but slow development of man's original capacities. Since men neither pursue their aims purely by instinct, as the animals do, nor act in accordance with any integral prearranged plan, like rational cosmopolitans, it would appear that no law-governed history of mankind is possible, as it would be, for example, with bees or beavers. I don't know why I was thinking of beavers there, but never mind. It doesn't really matter, the example. We find that despite the apparent wisdom of individual actions, here and there, everything as a whole is made up of folly and childish vanity, and often of childish malice and destructiveness. The result is that we do not know what sort of opinion we should form of our species, which is so proud of its supposed superiority. The only way out for the philosopher, since he cannot assume that mankind follows any rational purpose of its own in its collective actions, is for him to attempt to discover a purpose in nature behind the senseless course of human events, and decide whether it is after all possible to formulate in terms of a definite plan of nature a history of creatures who act without a plan of their own. Let us now see if we can succeed in finding a guiding principle for such a history, and then leave it to nature to produce someone capable of writing it along the lines suggested. Thus nature produced a Kepler, who found an unexpected means of reducing the eccentric orbits of the planets to definite laws, and a Newton, who explained these laws in terms of a universal natural cause. Hegel's main account of history is in Lectures on the Philosophy of History. It contains two distinctive features in contrast to those of his predecessors. First, he evinces skepticism toward the claims of philosophical historians to supply information about the end or the beginning of history that escaped the notice of empirical historians. History ends with the present. Hegel frequently describes the present in terms, for instance, as the full realization of freedom and self-consciousness that appears to leave little to happen in the future. Nonetheless, of course, there is more history to come, in particular America. But this, of course, is of no concern to the historian. Hegel singles out America in his philosophy of history, by the way, in case you're wondering why I mentioned America. But you can have a look at for yourself what he says about America, which unfortunately didn't quite live up to expectations, as we know it all too well. I must stop digressing. Second, Hegel considers the philosophical history to be a second-order enterprise that makes essential use of the results of other historians. The ambiguity of Geschichte is no accident, given that history, as the narration of events, emerges at the same time as strictly historical deeds and events. Societies that do not write history have no history. Historical deeds and events are in need of a self-consciousness that discloses itself in historical writing. Hence, nature has no history, given that it develops and changes merely in cyclical and repetitive ways. Although Rico, nowhere mentioned by Hegel, thought of history as cyclical and repetitive. But we don't need to complicate matters. Not yet anyway. It'll get complicated later on. Historical writing assumes three principal forms. Original history, that of the chronicler, records the deeds of a people and the time to which he or she belongs and whose spirit he or she shares. Reflective history records the deeds of the past but embodies the spirit of a later age and interprets the past in terms of it. Reflective history is of four kinds. Universal history records the whole history of a people, a country, or the world, on the basis of the work of original historians, of the work of original historians. Pragmatic history endeavours to assimilate the past to the present and to derive lessons for the present from it. Hegelian involves development and any... I need a proofreader, something's missing there. Hegel involves the development and any phase of history sublates... Hegel's philosophy of history involves development and any phase of history sublates the condition of its own emergence. Hence, past historical periods are of no direct relevance to the present. Historic deeds should not be explained in terms of trivial motives that are specific to no historical period. So pragmatic history as a genre is therefore out. So this is from Hegel's Encyclopedia Logic. In our modern era, what we call pragmatic historiography has often sinned quite notably with regard to great historical characters through this false separation between inward and outward, dimming and distorting the unprejudiced apprehension of them, instead of contenting themselves with simply narrating the great deeds that have been accomplished by heroes of world historical stature, and recognizing that their inner selves corresponds to the content of these deeds. The pragmatic historians have considered it a right and duty to scent out allegedly secret motives behind what lies open to the light of day, and their opinion has been that historical inquiry is all the deeper the more it succeeds in removing the halo of the hero who has hitherto been celebrated and praised, and degrading him with regard to his origin and his real significance, to the level of common mediocrity. In the interest of this kind of pragmatic historical inquiry, the study of psychology is often recommended too because it is supposed to yield information about the real motives by which people are generally determined to act. The psychology that is here appealed to, however, is nothing but that petty expertise about human nature which takes as the object of its study not what is universal and essential about human nature, but principally just what is peculiar and contingent, such as isolated drives, passions, and so on. Besides, although this is a psychological pragmatic approach to the motives that underlie great deeds would still leave the historian the choice between the substantial interests of the fatherland, of justice, of religious truth, etc., on the one hand, and the subjective and formal interests of vanity, ambition, avarice, etc., on the other, the latter are considered the real moving forces because, otherwise, the presupposed antithesis between what is inward, the disposition of the person acting, and what is outward, the content of the action, would not be borne out. But since inward and outward have in truth the same content, it must be expressly asserted against all such schoolmasterly cleverness that if the historical heroes had been only concerned with subjective and formal interest, they would not have accomplished what they did. And with references to the unity of inward and outward, it must be recognized that the great men willed what they did and did what they willed. I like that, against all schoolmasterly cleverness. When I was at school, my history teacher was so boring. And for some reason, we just went through the French Revolution and Napoleon. And I don't know why we didn't do British history. I might have found that interesting. Yes, I failed my O-level history, or GCSE history as it is now known. Anyway, it wasn't my fault, it was the teacher's fault. But I digress. Two more types of reflective history. Critical history assesses the sources and plausibility of other historical accounts. It is a history of history. Histories of specific fields such as art, right, religion, and philosophy. Hegel views the assumption of such a universal point of view as forming a transition from reflective history to, here we are, philosophical history. The philosophical historian employs the results of original and reflective historians to interpret history as the rational development of spirit in time, something that escapes the notice of both historical agents and other historians. History in general, said Hegel, is therefore the development of spirit in time, as nature is the development of the idea in space. Joyce actually refers to this in the Wake. Woman history of Fatamiliar familiars, repeating herself, on which purposeth, of the spirit of nature as divinely developed in time by Sadata follow me, the past and present. So another quote from Hegel here. History in general is therefore the development of spirit, well I've just said that, yes, development of spirit in time, as nature is the development of the idea in space. If then we cast a glance over the world's history generally, we see a vast picture of changes and transactions of infinitely manifold forms of people, states and individuals in unresting succession, everything that can enter into and interest the soul of man, all our sensibility to goodness, beauty and greatness, is called into play. On every hand, aims are adopted and pursued, which we recognize, whose accomplishment we desire, we hope and fear for them. In all these occurrences and changes, we behold human action and suffering predominant, everywhere something akin to ourselves, and therefore everywhere something that excites our interest, for or against. Sometimes it attracts us by beauty, freedom, and rich variety, sometimes by energy, such as enables even vice to make itself interesting. Sometimes we see the more comprehensive mass of some general interest advancing with comparative slowness and subsequently sacrificed to an infinite complication of trifling circumstances and so dissipated into atoms. Then again, with a vast expenditure of power, a trivial result is produced, while from what appears unimportant a tremendous issue proceeds. On every hand there is the motliest throng of events drawing us within the circle of its interest, and when one combination vanishes, another immediately appears in its place. The world spirit which embodies the idea is carried forward by the passions of individuals, in particular world historical individuals or heroes such as Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon, and so on, who, having merely a dim awareness of their historic purpose, but directed by the cunning of reason, through force bringing to pass a new epoch, millennium, see we're getting there, embodying a new and higher stage of spirit, of freedom, of self-consciousness. As opposed to, for instance, Kant and Voltaire, Hegel took the view that such heroes are beyond the assessment of mere common, moral, or ethical codes. Hegel gave lectures not only on world history but on the histories of art, religion, and philosophy. His profoundly historical outlook is, however, on display in all his works and coheres with several features of his thought. First, the individual is subordinate to the structures of objective and absolute spirit, which develop over history more obviously than individuals as such. Thus, pragmatic history needs to resort to petty personal motives. We've been to that already. The past stages of an entity are sublated in its present state, so that a full understanding of the present requires a knowledge of the past. What we are, and this is key to understanding Hegel, what we are at the same time historically. It's a key to understanding philosophy in general, I suppose, really, though. Do we but know it? So, this is some of the lectures on the history of philosophy. The acts of thought appear at first to be a matter of history, and therefore things of the past and outside our real existence. But in reality we are what we are through history, or more accurately, as in the history of thought, what has passed away is only one side, so in the present, what we have as a permanent possession is essentially bound up with our place in history. The possession of self-conscious reason, which belongs to us of the present world, did not arise suddenly, nor did it grow only from the soil of the present. This possession must be regarded as previously present, as an inheritance, and as the result of labour, the labour of all past generations of men. And just as the arts of outward life, the accumulated skill and invention, the customs and arrangements of social and political life are the result of the thought, care, and needs of the want, and the misery of the ingenuity, the plans, and the achievements of those who preceded us in history, so likewise, in science, and especially in philosophy, do we owe what we are to the tradition which, as Herdup has put it, like a holy chain, runs through all that was transient, and has therefore passed away. Thus has been preserved and transmitted to us what antiquity produced. And yet, one cannot understand something solely by knowing its history. Philosophical or, for instance, theological understanding involves more than simply recording past philosophical or religious beliefs. One must in addition discern the rationality of them and of their development. And furthermore, the past stages of humanity are radically different from its present state. Men and women in the past thought and acted in systematically different ways. But past forms of thought and action are related to our own in ways that are rationally intelligible, not in traditional logic, but in Hegel's logic of conflict and development. Since the historical process is rational, the historical fate of a doctrine or a way of life reflects its ultimate intellectual or ethical value, world history is the judgment of the world, which is, of course, namely the last judgment, actually. I'll put some references here. That's from the Philosophy of Right and the Encyclopedia. I shall quote from the Encyclopedia in a moment. This is a line adapted from Schiller's poem, Resignation. I shall read from that as well. Since the historical process is rational, the historical fate of a doctrine or a way of life reflects its ultimate intellectual or ethical value. This is from the Philosophy of Mind. The determinate spirit of a people, since it is actual and its freedom is as nature, has on this natural side the moment of geographical and climatic determinacy. It is in time and, as regards content, essentially has a particular principle and has to go through a development determined by this principle, of its consciousness and its actuality. It has a history within itself. As a limited spirit, its independence is a subordinate matter. The spirit passes over into universal world history, the events of which display the dialectic of the particular national spirits, the judgment of the world. World history is the judgment of the world. As I said, evoking the last judgment and adapting a line from Schiller. Although the translation I have reads a bit differently, it doesn't actually mention world history as such. But anyway, Resignation. This is an excerpt by Friedrich Schiller. I saw time fly to reach thy distant shore. I saw fair nature lie, a shriveled corpse, behind him evermore. No dead, from out of the grave, then sought to soar. Yet in the oath divine still trusted I. My every joy to thee I've sacrificed. I throw me now before thy judgment throne. The many scorn with boldness I've despised. Only thy gifts by me were ever prized. I ask my wages now, requiting one. With equal love I love each child of mine. A genius hid from sight exclaimed. 2 flowers, he cried. Ye mortals mark the sign. 2 flowers to greet the searchers wise entwine. Hope and enjoyment, they are named. Who of these flowers plucks one? Let him ne'er yearn to touch the other sister's bloom. Let him enjoy who has no faith etern. As earth this truth abstain, who faith can learn. The world's long story is the world's own doom. Hope thou hast felt, thy wages then are paid. Thy faith was formed, the rapture pledged to thee. Thou mightst have of the wise inquiry made. The minutes thou neglect'st, as they fade, are given back by no eternity. The world's long story is the world's own doom. World history is the world's judgment. In other words, so let's get to grips with the cunning of reason. From the Philosophy of History, a world historical individual is not so unwise as to indulge a variety of wishes to divide his regards. He is devoted to the one aim. Regardless of all else, it is even possible that such men may treat other great, even sacred interests inconsiderably, conduct which is indeed obnoxious to moral reprehension, but so mighty a form was trampled down many an innocent flower, crushed to pieces many an object in its path. The special interest of passion is thus inseparable from the active development of a general principle, for it is from the special and determinate and from its negation that the universal results. Particularity contends with its like, and some loss is involved in the issue. It is not the general idea that is implicated in opposition and combat, and that is exposed to danger. It remains in the background, untouched and uninjured. This may be called the cunning of reason, that it sets the passions to work for itself, while that which develops its existence through such impulsion pays the penalty and suffers loss. For it is phenomenal being that is so treated, and of this part is no value. Part is positive and real. The particular is for the most part of too trifling value as compared with the general. Individuals are sacrificed and abandoned. The idea pays the penalty of determinate existence and of corruptibility, not from itself, but from the passions of individuals. Universal history is the realization of the idea of reason in a succession of national spirits. These are manifested in the deeds of heroes, world historical individuals. I keep coming up with the same ones, and I'll try and think of some others. Alexander the Great, Caesar, Napoleon, Donald Trump. No, I'm just joking. Well, not really. I don't lose subscribers. By the idea... Okay, I need a proofreader. But the idea of reason does not work itself out in history in a way that would appear reasonable on the surface. It is not actualized in this or that of its stages as the consequence of men and women consciously adopting it as their ideal to translate it into actuality through their mode of life and conduct. It is not, so to speak, via the imitation of reason that reason is realized in history. Rather, it transpires through the cunning of reason. Another quote here. We assert, then, that nothing has been accomplished without interest on the part of the actors, and if interest be called passion, inasmuch as the whole of individuality, to the neglect of all other actual or possible interests and claims, is devoted to an object with every fibre of volition, concentrating all its desires and powers upon it, we may affirm absolutely that nothing great in the world has been accomplished without passion. Two elements, therefore, enter into the object of our investigation. The first, the idea; the second, the complex of human passions; the one the warp, and the other the woof of the vast Havas web of universal history. The concrete mean and union of the two is liberty, under the conditions of morality in a state. We have spoken of the idea of freedom as the nature of spirit and the absolute goal of history. Passion is regarded as a thing of sinister aspect, as more or less immoral. Man is required to have no passions. Passion, it is true, is not quite the suitable word for what I wish to express. I mean here nothing more than human activity as resulting from private interests, special, or if you will, self-seeking designs, with this qualification that the whole energy of will and character is devoted to their attainment, that other interests which would in themselves constitute attractive aims, or rather all things else, are sacrificed to them. History fulfills its ulterior rational designs in an indirect and conniving manner. It's difficult to find the language for it, really. I mean, I suppose, well, conniving seemed the right word there, but that's why I chose it. Devious, I don't know, whatever. It carries this out by calling into play the irrational element in human nature, that is, the passions. Hence, two elements enter into the investigation. First, the idea, and second, the complex of human passions, the one the warp, the other the woof of the vast tapestry of world history. By passion is meant those all-consuming emotions of the individual person which are self-regarding in nature. Nothing more is meant than human activity resulting from private interest, from special or self-seeking designs, with the qualification that the whole energy of will and character is devoted to the attainment of one aim, and that other interests or possible aims, indeed everything else, is sacrificed for the sake of this aim. It is not the ordinary human desire for happiness which we are to think of here. The self-seeking designs have nothing to do with mere pleasure, enjoyment, or welfare in the common sense of the word. History, this is bad news, I'm afraid. History is not the soil of happiness. The periods of happiness are blank pages in it. He is happy who finds his condition suited to his special character, will and fancy, and so enjoys himself in that condition. I like that characterization of being happy here. But the history of the world is not the theatre of happiness. Periods of happiness are blank pages in it, for they are periods of harmony, periods when the antithesis is in abeyance. Reflection on self, the freedom above described, is abstractly defined as the formal element of the activity of the absolute idea. The realizing activity, of which we have spoken, is the middle term of the syllogism, one of whose extremes is the universal essence, the idea, which reposes in the penetralia. I don't rather like that word for something other way. The penetralia of spirit, and the other, the complex of external things, objective matter. That activity is the medium by which the universal latent principle is translated into the domain of objectivity. In particular, the world's historical individuals whose passions drive them on to deeds of universal scope have not searched after happiness. It may be the case that they have derived a sort of subjective satisfaction from the pursuit of their aim, yet the aim was not to be happy, rather they wished to be great. This is the principal phrase here. By passions, what we have in mind here are the gamut of emotions that center in the will to be great. Pride, ambition, love of fame, yearning for power, the impulse to conquer. In sum, the passion for self-aggrandizement and the activity that results under the influence of this passion is a pursuit for dominance. So, we get to Aldiss. The War Millennia. This is from his first story in the series. To begin then, though it is certainly no beginning, the first fragments is of a strange past world, where clouds of nationalism have gathered and broken into a storm of war. Over the forgotten continents, Asia, America, Africa, missiles of destruction fly. The beleaguered people of that day have not fully comprehended the nature of the struggle in which they are engulfed. It is fitting that the first fragment should start with a man sitting helplessly in a chair while bombs fall. To be continued.